I'm super excited about the next talk. This is a game which is really, really beautiful and tells a very important story, and I'm super excited that we have Tobe here telling the story to us. It will be extended version of the talk last year. It will be a post-mortem talk, my favorite version of talks. So please give it up to Tobe and the flower collectors. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, everyone. All right, first things first, start the timer. Okay, so yeah, I'm Tobe from Mipumi Games in Vienna. And what you can expect from this talk is it's going to be two halves. The first half is where I briefly introduce the game and its inception and why it's so awesome, because that's what developers like to talk about. That's the part for me. And the second part is the post-mortem, which basically features what went right. And more importantly, and that's, I hope, interesting for you guys, what went wrong and what could have been done to fix it or remedy it and prevent it in the future. All right, so since I gave this talk in 2019 already online, I didn't practice it, so I'm going to wing it a little bit today. And I'm going to be looking at the slides a lot. But I've added a couple of DLC options for you, so if you've seen the talk already, there's 4 new slides and maybe you can spot them. So what is The Flower Collectors? It's a narrative crime game about a former policeman in a wheelchair. It's about observing and combining clues of a crime case. Here you see our crime wall, and it looks a bit like this. So I'm gonna leave this impression for a moment. You see here Jorge, who is the main actor of the game, is the policeman, and he teams up with Melinda, who is an aspiring journalist, to solve a political conspiracy. Now, how did we get the idea for this game? Basically, this here is my good friend Greg, who is at this point in time in a wheelchair because he is very clumsy and likes to fall downstairs. And so when he was in his wheelchair, he told me, I would really like to make a game that's basically like The Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock, where you have Jimmy Stewart sitting in a wheelchair, looking out the window and suddenly seeing something happening. And we also wanted to make something that's easily playable because we like telling stories without keeping people from experiencing them. So we looked at a game called Firewatch, which at that time was still rather new. And we wanted to combine these two things. So my goal as the creative director of the game was to avoid as many stereotypes as possible associated with the film noir crime genre, because everybody, when you say it's a crime game, then they already hear a saxophone playing in the background and it's all black and white, and somebody comes in and has this like in a monologue, and you know. So we said, let's avoid this part. And we also wanted to avoid computers and the internet, which is right now, nowadays, obviously how crime is being solved. But if you want to make a game about combining clues, that would probably be your worst enemy in terms of playability, because you don't want people to sit in front of a screen, in front of a screen, in front of a screen. So, taking these two goals, I decided to put the game into Spain, because I really like Spain. In the 70s, because there were no computers available to police people there yet. And it is actually a very under-featured time, in my opinion. And we also wanted to make it a little bit different, so I chose the concept of fable storytelling, which is basically using anthropomorphic animals to represent human characteristics. So yeah, we're not furries, but no problem with furries. Furries are cool too. Oh yeah, and I also decided there's not going to be a saxophone in the game. How did we do this? We have something called the Mipumi Day at Mipumi Games, which is once a month, a day where we can do whatever we want, as long as it's associated with the creative process of game development. And I talked to a former coworker at that point, and they said, you know what, we could actually try to do a prototype where we do the wheelchair. And Damien, at that time, still with us, decided to help me, and we actually managed to do the thing in VR. So it was really awesome. This is a screenshot looking through the VR glasses, where looking down at yourself in a wheelchair in a room. And this is Maria, our wonderful designer and programmer, testing it out. We had these motion controls, and you could actually turn the wheels and rotate around. And it was all fun and games until you went to the balcony, because then it got really scary. It's very far down, actually. And a lot of people actually got sick playing this game. So this is a very early version of the prototype looking down at their little town square in Barcelona, which is where the game is set, incidentally. So we took that little prototype and applied for a government grant. There's always, as Johannes already mentioned, good ideas to apply wherever you can. And there's a multitude of different grants. You can inform yourselves. And we actually did receive one. So we made a little project plan. I'm not sure how to get rid of the little box in the corner, but basically that's a long time ago anyway. So we went through, you know, the classical steps of pre-production, production, and so on and so forth. And the release date sort of held, I think. It's a long time ago, and it's not that interesting anyway. So we wanted to, when we wanted to make a story-based game, of course, we tried to build on the existing experience we had. We previously did a game called The Lion's Song, which was a point-and-click adventure game set in Vienna in the year 1911, and we collected a lot of experience working with writers and, you know, incorporating storytelling. So with that, we thought, let's just use that knowledge and build on that. Yeah, marketing shot here. And we also wanted to work with good writers again. So basically I got the wonderful, really amazing opportunity to contact writers with my outline for the story and the setting, and then have them write samples. So I actually did find 13 candidates, and I told them I want the bear in the wheelchair, and I want Melinda the journalist, and it's gonna be in Franco's Barcelona in the 1970s. And this is going to be our narrative arc, basically. This is something I can only recommend. Do this as early as possible, because it gives you an idea where you want to go with the story without having the details in there. So basically, that's kind of what I provided them with. And I gave them the opportunity to just write me a script in the classic movie format. You all know that. You know the one with the left, right, black and white, always the same length, very good for rhythm. And they could pick any scene, any character they came up with. And then I had a lot of paper to go through, which was amazing. The downside of this process is you get very attached to all the characters they write about. Sorry, I just destroyed the microphone. Is this still working? Okay. And you don't want to let any of them go, but you actually eventually have to. So I had to let 12 of those scripts go. And we decided to pick Greg Buchanan, who is a very talented writer in the UK. Actually, I think he just got his own TV show now. And it was amazing working with him. He gave me a first draft, an outline. We had a very good time plan, when to write everything. Everything was peachy. And he was very excited. And then the schedule slipped. And that was our cooperation with Greg Buchanan. So basically, I ended up using only the outline that he wrote, because he was not available after this time frame anymore, and wrote the story myself, which is probably the worst thing you can do as a creative director, because you really want somebody who knows how to do this, write the story. But luckily, we hired Michael Levar from Sweden, who's an amazing game designer and writer as well, and he basically rewrote everything that I wrote by keeping the tone, but actually putting in proper grammar and phrasing. Thank you. So basically, this is our cast of characters that we have in the game. Here's the protagonist and the sidekick, which is basically actually the character you play, right? You're just the cop in the wheelchair, but basically it's all about Melinda, who goes around and investigates the crime scene. There's a couple of people, I don't want to spoil now. Some of them are bad guys, some of them are good guys, some of them are mechanics. And that's the cast we actually managed to get into the game. Except for her, she never showed up in the game, and I'm very sorry about that part. Okay, there's a new version of Evernote available. I love those comedic interventions, right? So nice. Okay, so how we said about creating those characters is I'm very fond of those making of booklets of Japanese role-playing games, and they always have these character charts with the scaling in it. I can only recommend doing that if you have a character-based game. You just basically pick a scale and then everything models to that. So here, for example, is El Blanco, who is the bouncer in the nightclub on the other side of the street. He's rather tall. And there's my personal favorite, Lola, who is a singer. So you see the proper scaling here. I basically wrote a brief for our artist where I specifically didn't want to go too much into visual details, so he could actually do that, which is basically a short outline, the character arc, the conflicts and stuff, blah, 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 blah. We have a much larger template for this, but I actually found that keeping it short helps you in creating the characters, and it also helps the artists because they really didn't like reading that much. So this is Lola. She's based on Eddie Redmayne in the movie The Danish Girl. A very interesting, conflicted role placement, but still very good movie. And this is how she turned out in the game, the singer outfit and the street outfit. Yeah, and next part, sorry. This is actually new, so I'm gonna improvise now. So basically, the game, as I said before, is centered around Melinda, who's a journalist. And at that time in Spain, and I actually believe it's still the case, there's basically two major newspapers. There's a right-wing and a left-wing newspaper in Spain. And I actually asked my dad, who lives in Spain, to give me some explanations and examples for that. So you have the Vanguardia, which is basically the right-wing newspaper, and you have the Periodico, which is the workers' class newspaper. And you both, of course, we combined them into something, and that's our artist rendition of El País, which is also a newspaper in Spain, with one of the characters in there and stuff like that. But it's, of course, impossible to use those names, right? So my dad recommended just, throwing it in the fire, and we made our own newspapers based on that. And it turned out that the Periodico became Algún Diario, and Vanguardia became La Retaguardia, which is a bit of an insider joke, and maybe you can explain what it means. I don't speak Spanish. So yeah, we still have the left and the right wing newspapers in the game. And they actually featured there. You can actually find them with the binoculars and see them. Right, so how do you create a character in a wheelchair? First of all, I think we got the grant because we wanted to have the inclusivity aspect of the game. We wanted to feature a character in a wheelchair because we think it's not an impediment, it's an empowerment, and it's something that should be natural. And the goal for the gameplay was that when you move around in the game, it feels like in a normal first-person game. There should not be any different feelings, and I think we achieved that. But we, of course, still needed to do our research properly. So the first thing I did was I started researching wheelchairs and wheelchair models in the 70s and the 80s, and it turns out everybody gets it wrong. Everybody always does the classical wheelchair you get when you are sent to the hospitals, the ones with the big handles in the back, and nobody uses that. That's complete bullshit. But it's just like, if you don't do research, you pick the first thing you have in your mind. So basically, wheelchairs look much more different to that. And we contacted an agency in Vienna called My Ability, who specialized in accessibility, and they provided us with a consultant, Anish Singh, who was an amazing help. Anish actually is a professional basketball player, and he does YouTube tutorials for basketball, which is awesome. And he basically told me what his life was like. I got to see his apartment. We made changes to the kitchen in the game, so it actually had the pots and the cooking utensils at the right height and all that stuff. So I think that was really important, especially if you take on a serious topic. Do your research properly. It's just, embarrassing if you don't, and it's really not that hard. So then we went on to creating the characters in a style we wanted to do, and we wanted to do this comic style cell shading thing that was so trendy a couple of years ago. And it didn't work. They stood out too much. You basically saw them everywhere. You couldn't hide anybody. So, although I still love it, it had to go. We used a system called Mixamo, which is, I think, an Autodesk service that you can get for free, where you basically can just send in your character models and they get auto-rigged, and then you can just take prepared animations. That sounds really cheap. It is in both ways. It's not costly, but it's also qualitatively a little bit repetitive. However, you have to understand that we did this game on a people budget of about 3 to 4 people over certain months. So we had to use every help we could get. So I can recommend that. If you have an Autodesk subscription, look at Mixamo. It works really well. And the technical aspect actually was very good. So that's what it looked like when I just dropped the first animation on our little boy here. This is another character in the game. And those are all like animations you get for free. And yeah, we didn't use this one, but I like it a lot. That's one of the police people. Yeah, so that worked really well. So yeah, I wanted to show Barcelona because it was at that time in the 70s a very interesting place. You have to imagine there was the whole post-Second World War fascism regime of Generalissimo Franco. And nobody here knows about that because it's not part of our history. But there were decades of suppression, police brutality, and all that stuff. And it's a really interesting place. And Barcelona has always been a place of secret minorities. There's stories about brothels and nightclubs that got raided. There were gender diverse people there already that got basically prosecuted and just suddenly disappeared. And I thought, you know what? Maybe I'll just put that angle in the game a little bit because I have a personal interest in the topic. And so we said, let's take Barcelona. It's a great place. This is the first drawing I did on a notepad when I was on vacation when David freaked out and he was like, I have no idea what the game's going to look like. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to draw you something. And it's basically based on my memories of my father's apartment in Barcelona, which is amazing because as all of you who might have been to Barcelona already, it's basically a city that looks like it's made of building bricks. There's like square miles of repeating architecture, but it's amazing because it has all these small plazas and little streets, and they have a lot of shops there. So you have an insane amount of interactivity on a very compressed space. And as opposed to taking the rear window approach with the backyard, which has already been done, and you get sued for doing that actually, I thought, well, let's just do the streets in front because then you can have all these little, like mopeds going around and people delivering food and all that stuff. And the police find it much easier to arrive in their police cars when it's on the street as opposed to a backyard. So the pillars I wanted to have in the game were a certain kind of fragility that was basically a sign for the society at that time. So I used electric and telephone wires to show that. And I wanted to show the contrast of old versus new, which is kind of like the regime getting replaced eventually by democracy. There's a lot of modern concrete-based architecture in Barcelona that replaced the old Art Deco Gaudi style that you might have seen. So that's a really great place for contrast. And we went about that using mainly photos and Google Maps. So here, for example, that's a screenshot from Google Maps. I can recommend that. It's really awesome because it's 3D and you can just rotate around. That's a classic Roman church that we also featured in the game. And then at the end, we defined the colors to make up the mood and the consistency of the game. I think that part actually worked really well. And that's basically what it looks like when you play the game. So you have the view from Jorge's point of view with the little radio transmitter in his hand, looking down the balcony. There's the crime scene with the dead victim, of course. There's the cafe, the police, a little Vespa repair shop. And that's basically how it came together. Right, 18 minutes, awesome. No reason to panic. All right, how did we go about this? I have no idea what this means. Dissect story arc into chapters. Yeah, okay. So now we have a story that's been written. We have the, as I showed you already, the arc. But how do you go about creating the levels? Basically, what I did was I went back to this thing and created briefs for each of the chapters. So the game has actually, I think 11 chapters. And each of those is basically a scene we made in Unity. So every chapter has its own lighting mood, and the weather changes in the course of the game, so it gets a bit more dark, and then there's a storm, and then there's a resolution. And we did that by writing a treatment for each of the chapters. So that's basically what it looks like. It looks very similar to those movie scripts that I mentioned before already, just with extra little markers that basically link to the nodes in our storytelling system that we used. And that's a quite good way to work on it, because basically when you read through this, your reading speed, if it's sort of average, kind of is the speed of storytelling. So you can tell how long a scene is going to be, and you can always go and look at the linked editing elements. So we call those chapter beats. Yeah, stick to movie script. There's a reason why this thing still exists. Actually, it has its own format, and that everybody knows how to do that when they're professional, and it's really good. And it's also fun to write in that. Then I went and created a flow of events in our wiki page based on that script, and outlined that graphically, so people actually knew what was happening where. These are little legends for our characters, and where they're moving and what's happening where. The color coding in that case was about the stealth gameplay, which is something I'll get to later if there is time. And here you can see how that went. So basically, yeah, Lola goes over there and then the waiter follows and blah, 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 blah. A couple of examples. And I use this, like every chapter has its own wiki page, and I use this to basically like tell a top-down storyboard of what happens, and that was a really good way of getting the whole thing nailed before actually implementing it. Yeah, this is for example a sequence where you have to guide Donna Anna, who is an elderly old turtle who lives over there and keeps looking at you while you look at her with your binoculars. And at some point she calls you on your walkie-talkie and says that she's afraid of the police because she has stashes of marijuana hidden and she wants to get rid of that. So you have to help her with your binoculars to sneak from one palm tree to the next without the police noticing her. We actually had to change it from marijuana to poetry. So now she's hiding poetry, which is, I think, also quite poetic. Right, the same thing again. Skip this. And this is how it looks in Unity. So basically, we use a system called Fungus, which is a node-based scripting system that has dialogue lines on the side here. I recommend using this only if you're resistant to pain or have a programming person on the team that is able to debug and correct this stuff. We used it for gameplay as well, which was a mistake. But the scripting part worked really well because it allows you to very quickly script out a scene and just type it in and then immediately see it. So quick turnaround times, always a good idea. And here's those chapter beat names that you saw in the script before, so they have the same names. But then we also wanted to make sure that people actually got the story because it's very political and there's some details that you didn't want to miss. So after every chapter you play, in order to stick with the concept of helping a journalist, you assemble a very rudimentary newspaper page based on the clues that you found, but you have to pick the right one. So basically you take pictures with your camera all the time, and then you have a wall of little clues, and then you have to pull them in, and at the end you create a newspaper page. And you only know at the end of the game whether you did it right or wrong. If you do it wrong, it doesn't matter anyway, but you get a better ending if you did it right, actually. Right, so the reality. Finish a game on time and budget that is playable by everybody. Quite a nice goal, I would say. What happened? Yeah, first we thought we could do something like variable time slots, which was a concept I was very keen on, which was basically like people would repeat certain actions during the day and you could observe them anytime and then at some point assemble them together. I think that's a very interesting task for a simulation programmer, and at some point I hope somebody will solve this. We did not solve it. We actually made everything happen on one timeline, and it was just right, because at least that way you could author it properly. We had a really nice idea for stealth gameplay, which is basically you have to help Melinda, the sidekick character, not get spotted by the police, and you also should not get spotted yourself moving around like Jimmy Stewart in the movie. You have to duck and not be seen by the police. We got that into the game, and then we threw it out about 5 minutes before completing because it was not bug-proof enough. And if you have a crucial gameplay element that you rely on, you cannot do that this late. So actually we learned the hard way that you have to prototype your crucial gameplay early on in pre-production. So we had to go, and I'm actually sometimes wake up at night and cry about this. We wrote the story in-house. I'm a little bitter about that, but on the other hand, it was also a good experience. I think Greg would have done a much better job at writing the story because he's a very talented writer and he still doesn't talk to me anymore on Twitter. But, well, what can you do? I think it worked well enough. And we used the animations from the online resources. There was a workable way, but we got a lot of bad feedback about the repetitive animations. So if there was more money, then we could have thrown that at this problem. And we used a local musician who does not play saxophone. Florian Spies is a very talented composer and keyboarder. Actually, he's the keyboarder of a band called Wanda. You might have heard them, the Viennese rock band. And he played all the pieces for all the chapters with his studio musicians he hired especially for this project. One of the nice things of working with a local talent is that you can have them in very early on, show them the concept, show them the story, and they get sold on the idea. So basically together we developed something like a character-themed a musical layout where each of the main characters had their own little things. Melinda was the guitar part, Jorge was the guitar part, Melinda has the drum sections, and the bad guy has a trumpet. So it's not a saxophone, it's a trumpet. And whenever the trumpet comes, then you know something fishy is gonna happen. So that worked really well. He totally was sold to the idea, and then he wrote us a beautiful soundtrack that's actually available on CD. Yeah, as I said, no saxophone. So what went right? All the stuff, basically, I think the setting, the story, the political aspects, the voyeurism, you always feel a little bit bad for spying on people, which is what I intended. It's also a social commentary about the loneliness. I think that actually, I hope, worked out fine. We kept it simple. People were actually able to play the game, pick it up and just play it. The production aspect was amazing. We got help from a colleague, Eline from the Netherlands, who joined us and basically tied everything together. All my mannerisms and chaotic characteristics were helped by her. And as I just said, the local musician was a really good idea. Yeah, I need to work on my joke timing because now it's off. But what was left out, and I think that's the sadder part, as I said before, the story writing schedule, make sure if you have story writing to get that right. We got rid of a lot of the side stories of the characters. Each of the characters has their own little secret arcs and you can discover a lot about them in a background, but we never managed to tie it up. So you can find out these things, but there's no summary for that. I actually wanted to have some sort of like the newspaper, but for the personal stories. Yeah, we never got that in. And as I said, we had to take out the stealth gameplay at the very last moment, which is, I think, sad, because this is where now it's more or less only a story-driven game, but it could have been an action stealth game, maybe in part 2. Who knows? Oh, look, something new. Tools, yes. Our programmer, David, asked me to put this into the slide. Make sure that you have your tools for vital gameplay elements as soon as possible in the game. I cannot stress this enough. This is where you will spend 95% of your time if you don't have it, because you keep reiterating using Notepad or Excel for balancing and all that stupid ideas. Make sure you get somebody to pay the extra time in pre-production to create tools. It will pay off in no end, and you can actually use them on other projects later on. So that was really something that was important. Otherwise, you end up like our two mechanics with the tours flying off because somebody set up the colliders wrong, and then yeah, it was a new game for us, and the thing we learned was only add one new thing. So we thought storytelling is something we can do already. We'll just add the observation part and the timing and stuff. No, it didn't work. Just add one new thing, focus on that. I think that's a really good advice. And as I said, the editor is part of the gameplay logic. Make this work, because otherwise this thing that you see right here is something you will have to keep in your head all the time, and it will kill you. Also, skip and ditch everything that isn't immediately fun as soon as possible. Kill your darlings. It's sad, but sometimes it has to happen. Usually your gut feeling is much better than your brain anyway. The moment you feel like this doesn't really click, then just voice that opinion. The team will understand it. Yeah, get it all done in pre-production. Don't do it in production. If you do it in production, you will suffer. Oh yeah, and that's also a good thing. Every gameplay element, I would recommend planning it out meticulously. And by that I mean really every little beat in the following sequence of what you're doing. Imagine explaining it to your grandmother or to my grandmother. I do that all the time. Really write that down every little step, because there's so many implications that you make when you write game design, and usually that's where stuff gets lost. So just write down every step, it helps. How are we doing time-wise? Okay. Okay, I've got 1 minute left. Yeah, I said this already. Yeah, cinematics can be very tricky. Get that stuff worked out. Voiceover, we actually did voiceover. This can kill you if you're not prepared. You need a schedule for directing voiceover. You need a good plan, and you need to keep to your schedule as much as possible. Otherwise, you will end up burning time, and it costs a lot because voice actors are expensive. So Michael Leval, our writer and designer from Sweden, actually also directed the voice acting, and basically that's his hints. Book the same meeting room for all sessions so you know your setup. Don't count on the recordings working out. Sometimes you have to retake stuff, so basically always keep a buffer, and always write down your recording speed and what your burn down time was, basically, because otherwise you end up accumulating more and more time. You end up paying the voice actors extra. It's expensive. It's tiresome for everybody. So just basically write everything down, and it can take quite long. You know, when you have a call with somebody in LA who does the voice recording, and it's basically 3 in the morning, and then you do the whole take for all the chapters, and it's 4 hours in, you will actually fall asleep. It's sad but true. So have something to eat. Yeah, some people really like the game. I'm not sure how well it's sold actually, but I think that's also not really part of this presentation here. So thank you for coming. I think I wrapped it up in time.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Tobe. This was wonderful.
Do we have time for a question?
While we are setting up for the next speaker, we have time for some questions. Are there any questions from the audience?
All right. I guess not. Then I can't use my last slide. Can I show you my last slide?
I have a question. I have a question. Can I see the last slide, please?
I'm glad you asked that. So this is the last slide.
Thank you so much. Give it up for Tobe. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.